I'm Sarah Brindle, and I am one of the co-directors of Changing the Narrative. We are really excited to have everyone here. Few little details just quickly. If you can please stay on mute during the meeting. We have a lot of things to go through today. Janine's got it jam-packed for us, and just put any questions or things that you would like to know in the chat. And Chris and I, well, I'll introduce in a second, will keep track of the chat and try to get to the questions at the end. Chris?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you all here. My name is Chris Gierken. I'm co-director at Changing the Narrative and pleased to be part of this today. And it's my pleasure to introduce Janine Vanderberg.
Hi, everybody. So we are going to go through a PowerPoint and a presentation. If you have not already identified stereotypes that the general public has about aging and older people, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat along with your name and location, because we love seeing where people are from. So what we are going to talk about today is reframing aging. And really what we mean by reframing aging is changing the stories that we ourselves tell about aging and ageism, but also changing the stories that we allow other people to tell about us as we get older. This program is put on by Changing the Narrative. We were founded in 2018, and I'm thrilled that this year we became a Campaign of Next 50 initiative, which is a Colorado-based funder that funds innovations in aging and a number of things to help us all thrive as we get older. Our goal at Changing the Narrative, you can see in our tagline over there in the right-hand corner, it literally is to end ageism, not to reduce it by a little bit, but we want to end ageism. And one of the things that we know, and this is why it's reflected in our tagline, is the way that we can end ageism is by together. It is not a matter of one or two experts, it's all of us. So I am so thrilled that all of you are joining us today. So here's what we are going to cover in our brief time together. We're going to start with why you and why we're thrilled about the number of people who have responded to this. Talk briefly about what do we mean by reframing anyway. Why should we reframe aging? Why is that important at this moment in time? We are going to spend most of our time on how do we actually do this. We are going to leave time for your questions, but as Sarah mentioned, we have a lot to cover. So if you have questions that we don't have the opportunity to get to, I promise you that we will respond. We will look at the chat and we will respond to them in a follow-up email. And then really, we're going to want your ideas in the chat about what you can do to move forward to reframe aging, because again, our belief is the way that we are going to end aging, or not end aging, the way we are going to end ageism is together. Some agreements starting out. One of our primary rules is the no shame rule. And what do I mean by that? You may find yourself saying, that word that they said not to say, I said it yesterday. And there is no shame. Our goal is we are all learning together. The second agreement probably sounds a little bit weird. Feel free to plagiarize. The idea is we want people who care about aging and ageism to actually use similar messages, to tell similar stories. And if all of us are doing that, that is a way that we can counter the dominant narrative that all of aging is bad. So if you see something you like, feel free to use it. Sometimes people will say, well, I don't agree with something you're presenting. And that is certainly your choice. I do want to say that a lot of what we are presenting is based on very sound research by the Frameworks Institute. We'll talk more about them later. So we don't want to argue about the research. The research is simply the research. And that gets to our fourth agreement. You get to choose what you use. We hope that you will find some things that are helpful to you when you choose. And then finally, the way that we spread the word, the way that we create a movement is by all of us sharing. So if you have heard something that you think other people need to know this, go ahead and share what you learned. Feel free to ask us if we can provide you with additional resources and sharing whatever. That's how we are going to create the movement to end ageism. All right, so let's get started. Why you? Well, the first thing is you're here, right? So I'm making the assumption that you somehow care about this topic. You're here, you care. I want to talk, though, secondly, about this idea of trusted messengers. So one of the things that we know in reframing or framing any kind of social issue is that all of us listen to certain people who are in a way, in our circles. So all of you are trusted messengers within your own audiences. And what research has found, that when we are trying to change the stories that are being told, we hear it best from people that we know, that we already trust. So your status as trusted messenger within your own audience is what makes you a great candidate for reframing. And in a moment, we're going to be asking you, what are those audiences with whom you are that trusted messenger? And then finally, all of us actually have some sort of platforms in reach. The platforms may be, conversations that we have with friends and colleagues. The platforms may be social media. It may be a website that you operate. It may be a newsletter. You may be someone who is active in your local media, or maybe some of you have a national presence. All of us have platforms in reach. And if we use those platforms in reach towards this goal of reframing aging, again, we can create this movement. So I want to go ahead and launch a poll, which I call the YU poll. And the first question I'd like you, and we're just going to go through this really quickly, describe your relationship to older adults. Are you an older adult yourself? Are you an organization or maybe a business serving older adults? Are you someone who wants to target, for whatever reason, older adults in your marketing? Maybe you have products, maybe you have services that you offer to people who are older. Maybe, I always fingers crossed, you are an enlightened employer who realizes the benefits that older adults can bring to your team. So you'd like to employ older adults. Maybe you're a funder who funds programs for older adults. Maybe you're someone in the community who is out there championing age-friendly or age-inclusive policies. You might be someone who covers older adults in your own media, in blogs or podcasts, and you might be in some other categories as well. So if you are, please place your response in the chat. And then we'd like to hear from you. And we want you to think about throughout this presentation, through what platforms do you communicate with older adults? Traditional media, maybe social media. Do you have a website or blog? Do you give speeches or presentations? Do you have maybe an in-house newsletter or email? Most of us, at some point or another, are engaged in conversations with family, colleagues, or another. And very often, that's how we find out how we're surrounded by ageist messages when we hear very ageist remarks, for example, from people that we care about a great deal. And all of those are opportunities, right, to change the story that we tell. And again, other placed in chat. So I am going to leave this poll open for about another 30 seconds, and then we'll see what we've got. So we can see almost, actually over 40% of us put ourselves in the category of being older adults ourselves. We're 3/4 are in an organization or business serving older adults. Some of us would like to target older adults in marketing. I would like to see more people saying they'd like to employ older adults. Maybe you're not in a position to do that. We have some people who are funding programs for older adults, 35% championing age-inclusive policies. I am hoping by the time that we end that all of us will be motivated to champion age-inclusive policies. And, some of us actually cover older adults as part of our communications. And again, it is delightful to see the number of platforms. And one of the reasons I think that's so important is that all of us can use these platforms. And I'd encourage you to jot notes throughout our presentation today. If you hear something that resonates with you, think of how you can use that in a social media post, in a website, in your next speech, and so forth. And we can go ahead and create change that way. The idea, again, of reframing and having a group of people who use whatever platforms they have to go ahead and communicate in a consistent way is this idea of many voices in one choir. So all of us have different platforms. We have many voices. But if we have one choir that is consistently putting out messages about how it's important to reframe aging, and most importantly, communicating about those effective messages, we are in a much, much stronger position. So what do we mean by reframing anyway? Can anyone jot in the chat, what are those images that you are seeing in front of you?
Let's see, elephant leg and elephant, or elephants plural, depending on the answer here.
So, and this is based on kind of this fable about the blind man and the elephant, right? That we know that there's this whole creature called the elephant, but basically, depending on the part, we may only see the part. And if we only see the part, we may just see the leg and we may conclude that the leg is the elephant. And I would ask you to reflect for a moment, how does that apply to aging and kind of those thoughts that we have about getting older? Are we seeing the whole picture, or are we only seeing one part? Are we only seeing the trunk? Are we only seeing the leg? And basically what framing is a set of choices when we are communicating about what we are going to emphasize. Are we only going to talk about the leg, or are we going to talk about the whole elephant? What are maybe the things that we're going to leave unsaid? And how do we explain something like aging or ageism? And I encourage all of you to think about now how many times that you use these principles of reframing. If you, for example, have ever asked a boss for a raise, have you said, and by the way, I screwed up 3 times last week, or have you talked about what you contributed to the organization and what its goals are? How many of you have ever written a grant proposal? If you've written a grant proposal, you're always thinking about, how do I best position my organization, right? So all of us actually reframe in our day-to-day lives, and reframing is not fake news. It is not lying. It's basically portraying what is the full picture of a particular issue, and in this case, the particular issue being aging. What we want to do now is talk about, why should we reframe aging? And I'd like to invite all of you for a moment to go ahead and simply jot down in the chat, what are some reasons that you might reframe aging? And why are you here? What are some reasons that you think it's important to reframe aging?
To dispel myths, create a more equitable world, to be inclusive.
Absolutely. And so I would like to go ahead and put forward kind of 5 reasons to think about, in addition to what you've said. So the first reason really is this, that very often our current stories reflect really, really ageist beliefs. And what are some of those ageist beliefs that surround us? Frameworks Institute, which is a public policy research organization that studies communications, and they don't study how do we more effectively market detergent, for example. All they do is they study social issues like aging or ageism, and they find what are the general patterns of thinking. So based on a huge body of research that was published in 2017, Frameworks Institute found that there were these general patterns of thinking about aging. And keep in mind, because I know some of you are from outside of the United States, this research was conducted in the US, so it's not necessarily transferable, but we do know that ageism is rampant actually across the world. But a first pattern is, right, and so many of us think about this way and think about how that's reflected in the popular culture. Aging is all a time of decline, deterioration, dependence, depression, right? So in other words, aging is all downhill. There are no positive things to aging, and that's a really dominant theme in popular culture in the United States. There's a very strong theme of us versus them, and we see this in all of the kind of current arguments about gerontocracy. We see it in the newspaper headlines that say, well, the reason that there is a housing shortage is that baby boomers are keeping their houses. And as a baby boomer, I have to say, well, where exactly would I go if I didn't keep my house? Am I going to live on the streets? It doesn't, but there's that very strong us versus them. And us versus them is basically about pitting one generation against another instead of thinking, what actually do we have in common? The third current story that we have is has a strong theme of individualism. And what individualism sounds like this: if someone had taken better care of themselves, if they had saved more money, they wouldn't be facing any kind of precarious conditions as they got older. And what we know is that when we're talking very often about younger people, we recognize something that is called the social determinants of health. right? We realize that if someone grows up in a family with educated parents, has access to healthy, nutritious food, has access to a good education, they are going to fare better, right, than children who grow up without those things. But we don't think about how that really builds up over a lifetime. So when we make it an individual responsibility, it's someone's fault if they're not doing well as they get older, we are basically blaming someone for social conditions that may exist. Frameworks also found the fourth theme. There's a very strong theme of nostalgia or threat of modernity. And nostalgia sounds like this. Well, you know, in the good old days, there were pensions. In the good old days, everyone had Social Security. In the good old days, the kids took care of grandma. What might be problematic with that good old days kind of thinking? And I'd invite any of you to put your comments in the chat.
Janine, someone's already pointed out actually that people have changed, that what it meant to be 50 or 60 a while ago is not what it means to be now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else?
Good old days weren't good for everyone.
So both things are true, right? We know that the good old days weren't good for everyone. There's a reason why Social Security was founded. And because there were many older people who were literally facing life on the streets, right? And we also know that we've got a rapidly changing society. So simply looking backwards doesn't help us think about what are we going to do when, as someone pointed out, you know, we're living longer lives, and what are kind of the new ways of thinking and new kind of programs that we might need and so forth. And the final pattern of thinking that we realize isn't helpful and why it's important to reframe aging is that when frameworks asked people across the United States, and this was a huge sample size, when they asked them, so what do you think we should be doing around the aging of America? People kind of either came up with highly individualistic solutions like, well, people ought to save more money, or more education. Now, I served on the Denver Commission on Aging for several terms, and we always had resource fairs, and they were highly popular. But at some point, we had to step back and say, we can offer all the education in the world, but fundamentally in Denver, in Colorado, across the US, there simply isn't enough affordable housing for people of all ages. So simply providing more education about where someone might go for affordable housing hit that block of we didn't have solutions, right? And then finally, what frameworks found is that people thought there were no solutions. People were highly fatalistic. It's the equivalent of putting the blankies up over our head, right? So, you know, essentially, if we choose not to think about solutions, then we are not coming up with solutions. And so what we're going to propose to you today is there are alternatives for doing that. All of these are a result of a society that we have that literally ageism is baked into our DNA. And I'm offering a definition of ageism here, and I think it's important because we know we need to talk about ageism and the fact that it exists. Ageism is prejudice. It's how we feel. You know, it may be people saying, I just don't like older people, right? It can be stereotyping when we cast all older people as being digitally incompetent. You know, oh, my Uncle Harry doesn't know how to use a cell phone, therefore no older people know how to do that. And all of those, that prejudice and stereotyping actually results in discrimination, which we know is rampant, not only in the US, but around the world. In recent national polls, 93% of people age 50 and over reported experiencing everyday ageism. And AARP research has shown that over 3/4 of people age 50 and over have either witnessed or experienced ageism in the workplace, right? So we know that ageism is real. And we know that it has enormous negative impacts. It has negative impacts on our economic security, on how long we live, on our physical and mental health, and it also accelerates cognitive decline. So there's a reason why we need to move away from these prevalent ageist messages and reframe aging. The second reason that all of this is important is this. Current stories don't reflect the full reality of aging. So we know, right? One of the things we all have in common in this call is we are all aging, right? It's not like we wake up one day and it's like, oh my God, I'm an old person. We are all aging. For each one of us, today is the oldest we've ever been. Think about this before you go to sleep tonight. Today is the youngest I'll ever be. We are all aging. And the good news is aging is normal. It's a part of human development. And what is often not reflected, this is the part of the elephant that is not shown when people talk about aging, that actually aging brings growth and contribution if we don't allow ageism to get in the way. We also know that context matters. if we provide supports in our community so that people have access to walkable trails, to healthy, nutritious food, to social connection, to workplace, that we are going to fare better as we get older than if those things don't exist. And we also know that public policy can make a big difference. So current stories, though, don't often reflect that. This one, reason number 3, it probably should be reason number 1, but this is from the research of Dr. Becca Levy of the Yale School of Public Health. I think you all know I'm a huge fan. This is her book, Breaking the Age Code. We know, and her experiments have found, that if we are able to think positively about aging, despite everything that surrounds us, it is linked to increased longevity, on average 7.5 years, improved health, greater ability to recover from injury or illness, reduced likelihood of dementia by almost half, even among people who have the genetic marker for Alzheimer's. And one of her recent studies that was released this year showed that even once cognitive decline has started, among people who are able to cultivate positive beliefs, among them aging, improved memory, and it can reverse mild decline. Reason number 4, we are in a period of dramatic demographic change. Demographic change requires some innovation and new thinking. We can't be back in that nostalgia and threat of modernity. So we know that a baby born today, right? The longevity experts say a baby born today has a 50-50 chance of living to be to 100. We know that across the United States, we have this dramatic trend that you see in the second graphic in the chart of declining birth rates, right? And the result of that, of people living longer and for the most part healthier lives, we have increased longevity, right? And so in 1960, we had a population pyramid that looked like this, a whole lot of younger people tapering up to a very small number of older people. And in 2060, it's going to look like this, right? Much more barrel shaped, with equivalent numbers of people across the lifespan, across 5-year periods. And so that requires us to think differently and to communicate differently about what it means to age. And the final thing that we know, and why reframing is important, we know that actually reframing works. Reframing is a tested social change strategy. And I want to do this caveat. Reframing in and of itself, what you're going to learn today is not going to end ageism, right? And it's not going to improve things for older people, but it is part of a strategy that also needs to include community education and organizing, law and policy change, intergenerational connection. And collectively, those things can cause the kind of change that we are looking for. A lot of examples of narrative change for social change: marriage equality, moving away from rights to a message of love is love. Access to healthcare became broadened, still not near where it needs to be, but it became broadened when people started describing healthcare as a right, not a privilege. And more recently, when the opioid crisis started getting more government attention, is when it was reframed from a problem of individual addiction. So keep in mind that parallel to, if you're not doing well as you're older, it's kind of your fault, individual addiction problem, to a public health crisis. And what we know for reframing aging, because of the research that Frameworks Institute did with a sample size of over 12,000 people across the United States who are demographically representative of age, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and political affiliation, that these particular stories that we're sharing resulted in people improving their own attitudes about aging, decreasing bias against older adults, and increase the understanding in the general public of the need and support for public policy. And this is important for all of us who are out there, whether we're arguing in front of county commissioners or to funders, why there should be more funding, right, for programs that help people thrive in community. We need to have those reframed messages that help people see the need for policies that support all of us as we age. Okay, so how do we do this? What kind of stories actually change minds? And what I'm going to share with you is 4 general principles that you need to remember whenever you are communicating about aging and ageism. We will talk about 2 tested stories, and then we will share some language and image guidelines. And we also have those language and image guidelines in a very short, a 2.5-page publication we put out, Guidelines for Age Inclusive Communications, that we will share with everyone who registered for this after the workshop, along with a recording and a PDF of this deck. So principle number one is we need to move away from individual episodic stories. And this can sometimes feel problematic for people like me who are trained as fundraisers, right? Because what did we always do? We did, poor person, send money now, right? That's kind of the formula that we thought was successful for getting funding. These are some individual stories that I've heard among many in my role at Changing the Narrative. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first one. You can see the rest, but I was doing a workshop on the Western Slope. This was pre-pandemic, and it was a workshop actually with Next 50 Initiative, and they were providing kind of some food after. It was kind of a workshop and refreshments. And as the workshop was winding down and people were having the refreshments, I noticed a group of women then in my age in their 60s, stuffing sacks with the refreshment leftovers. And I sat down and I talked with them and I was like, what, happy, take them, because otherwise I don't know what we would have done with the refreshments. What's going on? And they talked about, these were women my age who were trying to live on $500 and $600 a month of Social Security, wanted to work, could not get jobs despite the fact of solid work experience. And despite the fact that this particular town I was in had help wanted signs all over, restaurant shops, etc. And they simply told me these shops wouldn't hire them. So this is an example of an individual episodic story. And I could tell this story, but it's not going to be effective. It's not going to be as effective as, quote, widening the lens to provide a systemic view. The story of these women in Mesa County was not just the story of these women in Mesa County. It's a story about workplace age discrimination. And that when we have workforce development dollars coming into our communities, we need to make sure we can't just throw up our hands and say, older people don't know how to use computers. We need to make sure that our workforce development dollars, our public investments are being used to train people on the skills that are needed, et cetera. So can we tell an individual story? Sure, we can, but we can't just stop there, because then it triggers that individualistic thinking, this person made bad choices in their life. Instead, we've got to widen the lens and we've got to provide systems view. So that's principle number one. The second thing that we've got to do is people so often find this issue so overwhelming. Oh, we've got an aging society, right? We've got silver tsunami. It's going to be an economic burden, that we've got to talk about concrete and collective solutions. Now, the good news is that I know many of you are seeing the names that popped up on the screen when we admitted people. I know that many of you are working on concrete collective solutions in your communities, and you need to make sure that you are telling those stories. The way that we reframe aging and we counter ageism is by talking about those community-driven solutions. So what do I mean by a collective solution? An individualistic solution is telling someone who is facing workplace age discrimination, well, just shave yours off your resume or dye your hair. Those are individual choices. And if someone wants to do that, fine. But what's more effective, and I'm really proud that in Colorado, we were able to do this year with the help of some excellent legislators, asking employers to remove graduation dates and other age identifiers from job applications. Those are the kind of collective solutions that we need to work forward. So principle number two is we need to talk about concrete collective solutions so that people understand that things can be done. We need to avoid stories that don't work. And some of you may use these stories, and I'm just going to, and again, you get to choose what you use, but I want to encourage you to think about what frameworks found about these particular stories. And frameworks tested these stories because they were very often used by some of the leading aging organizations. And when frameworks tested them, they found these stories are actually counterproductive. What do I mean by super senior story is counterproductive? And it's one that many of us who are maybe in organizations serving older adults like to tell. Here's our super senior in the community. Now, I am based in Colorado on the Western Slope, and a super senior on the Western Slope in Colorado is 80 and hiking 14ers when she's not skydiving or about to appear on America's Top Model, right? Those are kind of super senior stories. And the problem with super senior stories, even though we kind of like to tell them, is they lead to two kinds of thinking. One, very individualistic. Well, if that person can do it, why do we need any kind of supports for older people in general to be in community? Because look, obviously some people are doing just fine. That's kind of reaction number one, why it doesn't work. And reaction number two is that there are people like me who are like, okay, I didn't do this when I was 30, so I'm certainly not going to do this when I'm 80. And we just kind of check out, right? So that's an example of a story that doesn't work. We want to move away from demographic crisis, silver tsunami, the gray wave, going off the gray cliff, all of these kind of metaphors that somehow suggest that people getting older is a disaster and is going to bankrupt communities. And what we need to do instead, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is how do we portray the aging of our communities is actually an opportunity to get things done. One of the tactics that was used by some of the leading aging organizations that were behind this research was comparing ageism to other isms like racism or sexism, or kind of creating a civil rights movement. And even though the civil rights metaphor worked really well for the disability rights movement, it does not test well for dealing with ageism. What frameworks found happen is often people who had experienced racism or sexism thought, well, it can't possibly be as bad, so therefore there must be something wrong with those old people. One, I'm saying that tongue in cheek. But the other thing was it limited people's thinking to strictly legalistic solutions. If you're facing ageism, just complain to the Civil Rights Commission and to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, instead of encouraging community to come together and say, okay, so what do we want to do to improve our community for people of all ages? And that's really what we're looking for. We're looking for community-driven collective solutions. And then this final story just became nutty during the pandemic, right? How many times did we hear very well-meaning elected officials and public health officials say something? I felt like we were being patted on the head all the time. We must protect our weak, vulnerable elderly. That's called compassionate ageism. And what it does is it just creates, yes, are there some people who are more vulnerable than others? Yes. Are there some of us who, as we get older, are experiencing frailty? Absolutely. And there's a whole other workshop that we could do about how you reframe frailty. But what it does, that constant thing, that constant drumbeat during the pandemic, started people thinking, well, that's what it means to get older. It reinforced all of that decline, depression, deterioration, and it leads people to think of, well, if it's all downhill anyway, why are we going to invest any kind of money in community programs to help older people when it's all decline anyway, right? So there are dangers of all of these stories. So what do we want to do instead? Principle number 4 is we want to use tested stories. And what do I mean by tested stories? Frameworks Institute has basically kind of a pattern of talking about social issues that they have found is effective. Now, do you need to do it exactly in this order? No, and this is probably the wonkiest part of the presentation. But what Framework says is, instead of leading with the individual sad story, here's my sad senior story, and please funders send money now, is let's talk about this issue with this kind of frame around it. Let's lead with shared values that we have. And we'll talk about some of those tested values for a moment, because we're letting people know, why does it matter to talk about aging? Why does it matter to talk about the aging of our communities? So we want to talk about why it matters. We need to explain how the issue works. So de facto, if you are on this call, it's because you know something about aging, you know something about ageism. And you may have the reaction that I used to have when I, go home and talk to my parents about what I did. And it was almost like, patting on the head. It was like, oh, that's nice, dear. That sounds really worthwhile. But people really don't understand this work, and they don't understand really what aging is like. So we need to explain it. And we can use metaphors and examples, and we need to let people know what is working. And we need to let people know what isn't working. And to me, a prime example of what isn't working is we have this national talent shortage. I call it the perplexing paradox. We have 10 million unfilled jobs, 2 unfilled jobs for every single person looking for a job. And yet what happens? Older people are routinely ignored and discriminated against. We need to explain that, and we can't make the assumption that people know it. And then finally, I want to go back to solutions. We need to put forward, what can we do about the problem we are raising? So those are the kind of the 4 principles. And now I'm going to go through the 2 storylines, and they're not an individualistic story, but they're a storyline that follow this formula that Frameworks found was effective in shifting people's thinking, in making them more likely to open their wallets, to open their public policy heads, and to decreasing bias against older people. The first story, Frameworks called, you'll see it at the bottom, Embracing the Dynamic. And it's a way to talk about demographic change. Instead of saying, oh, it's a silver tsunami, everything is going to be an economic disaster. We want to talk about demographic change as an opportunity. We want to talk about older adults in our community as resources. And I'm going to say in, my own community in the North Fork Valley, I see that every day. We absolutely have an aging community. And the people who are volunteering, who are stepping up, who are helping younger generations are very often those older adults. But if we don't tell that story, we allow other people to tell the stories about us, that it's all decline and deterioration. And the images here, which you can find on our age-friendly photo library, which is on the Next 50 Initiative website, are all the people that actually I personally know who are great examples of, older adults who are out there in community getting things done. So the value that we start with, remember, we're talking value, explanation, solution. The value that we want to lead in is innovation, ingenuity and innovation. Our country prizes, right, our spirit of innovation. And I'd encourage each of you to think about, what is something that exists today that didn't exist 10 years ago? We're a nation of problem solvers. Many of our communities, there probably isn't a governor of any state in the United States that doesn't proclaim that his or her state is the innovation state, right? Well, we have that spirit of innovation, and we need to apply that spirit of innovation to our work and to what we are going to do to take advantage of the opportunity that we have in aging society. What I would encourage all of you who are running programs for older adults or trying to seek funding for programs for older adults is to really lead with and think about, how is what you're doing an innovation of what has come before? And you want to put that forward, not just we are providing services to these 4 seniors, but you want to say things like, you know what, we do have an aging community and we see this as an opportunity. And here are some of the innovative solutions that we are using. That's a way to use this value. The second thing we need to do is we need to explain aging. And this is where we move away just from the leg of the elephant to the, yes, are there downsides to aging? I will say, as someone who just turned 70, absolutely. It wasn't the fact of turning 70. It was a fact of an injury that I had that ended up absolutely causing some of those downside and decline that we often talk about aging. But we also want to talk about the positive part. This idea, Frameworks calls it building momentum. But getting older is a dynamic process, right? And we change all the time and we gain experience and insight. I'd encourage each of you to think about, what is one thing that you know right now today that you didn't know a year ago, however painfully learned, right? All of us, as we get older, build up these insights, connections, experience over time. If we don't allow ageism to push us out as communities, all of this can benefit the communities that we live in. All of us need to put that message forward, that older adults aren't a burden. Older adults can be an opportunity for our workforces in our community. And then finally, we need to offer concrete solutions, right? So an example of a concrete solution that tested really well when Frameworks tested was anything intergenerational. So if any element of what you are doing is intergenerational, you want to highlight that in your communications. And if it isn't, think about how you can work across generations and avoid those generational stereotypes. So an example here, our intergenerational reciprocal mentoring program helps younger and older workers alike, leading to better team problem solving. There's a group in Colorado that did this really well. Here's just I'm not going to play the clip of the film, but I am going to send it to you after. And it was a partnership for age-friendly communities in Larimer County and AARP. And they did this very short film to highlight from employers how they should be thinking about older workers as a way to solve their talent. And they led with that value of ingenuity, right? Hey, we've got a hiring shortage in our community. We've got to apply our spirit of ingenuity and innovation to get there. We need to explain. The explanation was, you know what? Older workers in our community, they've got a lot of insight, experience. We know strong communication skills and connections that are built up over time. And their solution, let's have internship and returnship programs that can bring on older workers into our employers to help address those talent shortages. And I love the title they came up for it, Profit from Experience. So that's kind of story number one. It's called Embracing the Dynamic, but it's different, basically a different way to talk about older adults as an opportunity and not a burden. The second story is a way to talk about ageism, and it's called Confronting Injustice. We need to talk about ageism, not as a civil rights issue, but it's a matter of simple justice. Right now, older people, for the most part, are not treated as equals. Contributions marginalized, ignored, pushed out of the way, often with a get out of the way old person kind of message to it. And so we need to recognize that in our society, justice certainly has not been achieved for other groups. So that's one of the reasons, like I never like to say, and I hope none of you say ageism is, the last remaining prejudice. We certainly know there's still prejudice based on race, on disability, LGBTQ status, but we do want to acknowledge that in our society, justice is an aspirational, and we aspire to have a just society for people of all ages. We need to explain ageism and what its effects are. That's why we had those slides at the beginning, because most people don't know what ageism is. Chris and I had the opportunity to do an in-person workshop in Breckenridge last week, and it was fabulous. And we asked people, how many of you have really been exposed to any kind of training about ageism? And this is a very knowledgeable group. And I think there were 3 people out of 70 who raised their hand. Most people don't know what ageism is, so we need to explain it. And here are some talking points that you can use to do it. Frameworks also found that when we're talking about ageism, important to use workplace age discrimination as an example. And it's important to use that as an example because people kind of understand how workplace age discrimination works. They understand what it means, even if they haven't directly experienced it. We need to explain implicit bias, also called unconscious bias. And it's a bias that all of us have, and very often we aren't even aware of it. We've received messages right from the time we're very young. Young is good, old is bad, et cetera. So we've got, and this results actually in another one of these very strange, paradoxes that actually the older we get, you would think we would become less biased against older people, but actually the older we get, the more ageist that we become. And my theory is that we've absorbed these messages about how aging is bad for longer, right? The good news is when we explain implicit bias to people, and feel free, this is one of those things, absolutely feel free to plagiarize. When we explain how implicit bias works, people are actually less likely to act on it. So that's a good thing. And then finally, we need to, again, when we're talking about ageism, we can't just say ageism is bad, right? We've got this huge problem. We need to provide concrete systemic solutions. That's one of the reasons that changing the narrative, and because of the number of stories that we've heard about people experiencing workplace age discrimination in our age-friendly workplace initiative, we actually work on all of these things. We work to eliminate graduation dates from job applications. We train managers on implicit bias. We are advocates to include age and DEI policy. We're advocates for strengthening age discrimination laws, but these are all examples of, instead of just throwing up our hands and saying nothing can be done, that we can actually do something. Finally, we're going to talk about language and images matter. I'm just going to briefly go through these, and we will be sending you not only this, but our guidelines to age-inclusive communication. So when we are talking about older adults and aging, we want to move away from elderly, senior, and senior citizen. Frameworks found that that language actually queued up all of those negative stereotypes about older people. So the recommended terminology instead is to use older adults, older persons, or descriptive language. And what do I mean by descriptive language? If you have a program that serves people age 60 and over, say, my program serves people age 60 and over. If you are a career coach who coaches people who are in transition, who are age 50 and over, say that, but don't say, senior citizen. We need to move away from they and them, right? It's us and we. We are all getting older. Obviously, you would expect changing the narrative to say we want to avoid that we are anti-aging, right? We are pro-aging. We need to acknowledge that aging is a normal dynamic process. And what we are about, instead of telling people they should have made better choices back then, that's not helpful, right? We need to improve social context. We need creative solutions like many of you offer. When we are talking about ageism, what is important is to always define and explain how it works. And we don't want to compare it to other isms, as I just mentioned, but we do want to talk about it as a matter of justice. And finally, can we just stop talking about eliminate? And this, remember when I said at the beginning, this is the no shame rule. When I was trained by Frameworks Institute back in 2017, I realized that the day before I went into training, I had used the term silver tsunami, and probably in a grant proposal. We want to avoid silver tsunami, gray wave, going off the demographic cliff. And we want to acknowledge demographic reality. People are living longer and mostly healthier lives. Birth rates are declining. This is something we should celebrate, and we need to look at the opportunity instead. And the way we do that is we're going to use our ingenuity. We're going to re-envision what's possible. We're going to create new policies and programs. Many of you have already done that to address a changing world. And then finally, be mindful of visuals. And I know how hard it is, but let's avoid the wrinkly hands and the sad, lonely person looking out the window. In my case, I look out the window and I see the deer and the elk, but right, let's instead use pictures that portray the full range of aging. And in our guidelines for age-inclusive communications, you will see some links to some free sources where you can source some of those images. So I am going to pause right now. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to ask you, if you have questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat. And Chris and Sarah, if you can queue up questions, this is always my favorite time of any workshop, is to see what you have to say.
One of the questions that came in earlier, someone asked, why do DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, fail to consider ageism or age in their programs?
Okay, I promise you, I did not put that question in the chat, but this is who did. Okay,
I did.
You, Perry.
Very true.
And I actually, it is because of that implicit bias that people have, that ageism is, and it's because of ageism, so that people don't even think. People don't understand what older people experience in the workforce. And honestly, before I started changing the narrative, I didn't have a sense. I ran a consulting firm where I was the older person, and actually, and so this is important to note, we didn't talk about at the beginning, ageism can also be directed against younger people. So when younger people aren't given opportunities, I always had a multi-generational workforce in my consulting firm. And so very often I saw ageism in the other direction. People don't think, they don't understand what ageism is, and they don't understand that older people experience it. The hopeful news that I'm seeing, Perry, is I'm starting to see personally, as Janine Vandenberg changing the narrative, more and more people requesting workshops, more and more companies who are starting to say, okay, maybe I need to think about this age thing as a DEI. But I think this is an area when I talk about we need to do this together. All of us can do this. And we'll be doing a workshop soon on the business case for older workers and intergenerational teams. And there's a very strong business case. And one of the things that we talk about is why age needs to be part of DEI. And the reality is, it is just smart business. As Perry, if you ask the question, you probably already know that when you have intergenerational teams, you have better team problem solving, right? More productive, and for private sector companies, more profitable. So those are all good reasons. Okay, next question. Yeah.
What if the name of your organization, your group has a word in it that you would just mention not to use, like a senior
Yeah.
center?
Yeah.
How do you
Okay. So
use it?
Senior Center, I was hoping that nobody had a name in their organization called Silver Tsunami. So seniors, and I actually, so we've done a whole workshop on that. I think we did it last summer. And here's what's important. You know, I know as a leader of an organization that underwent several name changes, that name changes aren't easy. So I'm not going to say anyone change your name tomorrow, even though that is a choice that some people are making. So for example, I am on the board of the Center for Workforce Inclusion Labs, and they used to be Senior Employment Support Services or something like that. But they realized that they had a more powerful message to get in front of employers if of talking about the benefits of workforce inclusion, right? We know that some, quote, senior centers are becoming, more broadly community centers and that kind of thing. What is more important than what is in your name is in how you are communicating to the general public. So if you have senior in your name and it makes sense to continue it, you can still use these recommendations when you are describing who you serve. You can, talk about older adults. You can talk about, our particular program serves people this age and over, that kind of thing, or people who are facing these kind of challenges, etc. So don't obsess about the name. Don't obsess about the name. But if you are inclined to change your name, know that there is a growing movement to do that. And one of the reasons that some organizations that have senior in their name, especially senior centers, are doing it, is that there are a number of people of my generation who are just like, I'm not going to a senior center. Now, that is ageism on our part as well, but there is. So there are very good marketing reasons, right, to do that. So
next question is, do you have any examples of how to respond to professionals, business owners, healthcare providers who use elder speak and dismiss people due to their age?
Oh, Chris, can you answer the question of what we can do to people who have elder speak? Because I think we have a whole chart on that. Chris also, besides being co-director, is also heads up our age-inclusive, age-friendly healthcare work. What can people do when faced with elder speak, Chris?
Yes, they can respond respectfully, and we have some great tip sheets on that, on just examples of when you hear something that's ageist and then what you could say in response to that as examples. So we have a few different resources on that, which we could share in our follow-up email with you all. But it's, it happens in all different settings, right? And the problem with it is that we don't anticipate it coming, being directed at us, some ageist comment or statement. So we feel unprepared. So the more you learn about ageism, the more you'll feel prepared to respond to something that isn't sarcastic or disrespectful, but just as more empowered and standing up for yourself. So we have really great examples of that. And if for those that don't know, elder speak is speaking to an older person as though they're a child, and it's not intended to be hurtful, but it actually is. It does physical and mental health, negatively impacts our physical and mental health. So there's evidence that backs that up.
And Chris, this actually happened to me, as you well know, when I turned 65. It was around the same time I was starting changing the narrative 5 years ago. And I walk into my doctor's office, the same doctor's office that I had been to, year after year. I'm not much of a doctor frequenter, but I, do my annual thing. And all of a sudden I was being greeted, "Hi, Mrs. V, how are you?" And I'm looking around, I'm like, who are they talking to? I'm the same person I was a year ago, and kind of, anyway, yeah. I was like, do they have notes once people turn age 65 that our voice is going to turn high pitched? And crazy. Anything else? I think we have time for a few more questions.
Yeah, we're actually talking about ageism in healthcare tomorrow. So I actually just put the link to that if someone would like to talk about that, but there's an event tomorrow morning. So check in the chat on that. Janine, someone else, you touched on this just a second ago, but someone was just pointing out that ageism goes in both directions. And I was curious how you would respond to that, because I know we tend to talk about it as older adults. And I think that the preponderance of people on the call, but at the same time to talk about how it impacts us at ages.
Yeah. So reframing aging is one of the workshops that Changing the Narrative does. And I was when Frameworks Institute published this research in 2017, they invited people. I was one of the first 10 people. So I'm like an original trainer on this. And we've continued to do reframing aging because we think it's important. But we also, when we do workshops on other topics like one of our workshops is ending ageism together, we talk about how ageism is in both directions. One of the things, and the way it can look like for younger people, and actually the World Health Organization report when they launched the global campaign to end ageism in 2021, they found that 1 in 2 younger people actually had experienced ageism. And usually it takes place in the workplace where, you know, people look at someone, and for women, this is often interspersed with our looks, right? It's sort of, oh, you look young, or you look too cute to be serious. And so the way it tends to play out for younger people is not given opportunity. Someone says, oh, it's not your turn yet. People make assumptions that you don't have the experience without looking at whether you have the skill yet or that kind of thing. There was a really fascinating article in the Harvard Business Review, and I actually wrote a short blog on it, that for women, there is no right age, right? I compared it to Goldilocks, right? Too hot, too cold, just right. For women, we are never just the right age. We are too young, right? So we are discarded, or we're assumed to be, you know, support staff or that kind of thing. And then we all know, many of us on this call have experienced the too old all of a sudden like this. But even in the middle, assumptions are made about women, about child, you know, we're just going to leave to go to soccer games. Yes, we are. I did, and that kind of thing. And to me, what's important, the takeaway from it, is not to just throw our hands up in the air, but we realize that we need to have allies of all ages, right? We need to be engaging younger people and people of all ages in the fight to end ageism, right? I think it is important for those of us who are older to do it. And but we need to engage people of all ages of doing it. I want to thank you all so much. You'll get a follow-up email from us that will have a copy of the deck. It will have our guidelines. It will have responses to some of these questions. And if you, I'm thinking that most of you, if you're here, are on our mailing list, but we are going to continue to do a series of workshops through the fall. And for those of you who want to be able to speak up in your own communities, if you like speaking, facilitation of training, we're also going to be doing training of trainers throughout this fall. So whether you want to do, workshops on topics like this, on the business case for older workers and intergenerational teams, on ending ageism, keep looking at our mailing list and you will see lots of opportunities. So thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you do. And thank you for caring. This is an important issue. And we really believe that together we can end ageism.